Where are the strengths of quarterback Tommy DeVito's game? How does it differ from Daniel Jones's? And what's the Giants' future at the quarterback position? We're covering all that and more with special guest Mark Schofield on today's Locked On Giants podcast. That's coming your way next.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This episode of the Locked On Giants podcast is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. My name is Patricia Traina. And a big shout out to all my everydayers, my newcomers, my Blue Crew community members, and everybody in between. Appreciate you tuning in to the Locked On Giants podcast. And on today's show, I have Mark Schofield of SB Nation. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Mark Schofield or his work, he is an excellent X's and O's guy, specifically when it comes to quarterbacks. And he's here today. We're going to pick his brain a little bit about the Giants quarterback situation, Tommy DeVito. We're going to talk a little bit about Daniel Jones. We'll even dip into the draft class a little bit to see what Mark has to say about those prospects. So, Mark, my friend, great to see you as always.
Oh, Patricia, it's great to be back. It's been far too long since we got a chance to do a show together, but excited to be here. It's a very exciting time for Giants fans, honestly. And I say this as you can see over my shoulder. I always do that right there. You see a lot of Patriots stuff. I am a Patriots fan, but it's been very, very fun to watch this Giants team from afar, from a distance, as sort of a neutral observer these past couple of weeks. I'm kind of riding the Tommy DeVito train along with everybody else. It's got me thinking, honestly. So my grandfather, Ray Paradiso, born outside of Rome, comes to the United States as a kid, ends up serving his country in World War II, comes back from World War II, and he does a couple of things in the Boston area. He gets a job, he settles down, and he gets Red Sox season tickets. He loved the Boston Red Sox, had them from like 1946 to the 1990s. Like, you name a big game in Red Sox history, either my grandfather or somebody was there. He didn't like the Yankees, I'll just say that. But he had a soft spot for Joe DiMaggio. Because it's a good Italian boy doing well. So he loved seeing DiMaggio when he would come to Boston. And he would tell stories about seeing DiMaggio and Williams and all the greats. Is Tommy DeVito my Joe DiMaggio? I don't know. But I raised that the other day at the SB Nation Slack chat. I'm like, look, I'm a Patriots guy, but there's something about seeing him play well that's kind of captured my attention. So it's been a ton of fun to watch from afar.
Definitely. He's certainly come out of nowhere. And, Mark, let's start off. I want to get your overall take on what you have seen from DeVito's game, what he does well, what he's still developing, and where he's maybe, not as strong as he could be.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it comes with the reasons why he went undrafted. I mean, first of all, the situations he was in, sort of in Illinois and Syracuse, didn't have a ton of talent around him. Made some good throws for both of those teams, showed a little bit of pocket movement ability and some athleticism, but, it was still sort of a project. There was still ways that he would have to go to become sort of an NFL, backup quarterback, let alone a starter. And there are certain things that he'll need to improve on if he wants to potentially win this job going forward. I think, the arm talent, it's good enough, but he could always sort of improve there. And I think that's something that I'm going to be watching sort of going forward. I think, and we've talked over the years about all quarterbacks need to get faster with decision-making. And he's been very good in that regard, I'd say. But I think you can always improve there. And another thing to sort of watch is, the idea of what is he going to do now that teams have sort of seen him. We've seen this before. Josh Dobbs this season is an example of that, where you come in initially, it's kind of a clean slate. He did it in Arizona. He did it in Minnesota, where defenses don't know what to expect. Then after 2 or 3 games, they're like, oh, okay, this is what we can look for. This is what we can expect. And you see what happens. Josh Dobbs this week is now getting benched for Nick Mullins as the Vikings fight for their playoff lives. And so teams now have a couple of weeks on Tommy DeVito, on what Mike Kafka and Brian Dable are doing with him conceptually in the passing game and even in the run game. What do they do and how does he respond? That's something that I'll be watching as well. But things that do stand out, pocket movement. I think that's been very impressive from him. And certainly in recent weeks, you've seen them cut down on sacks. You've seen him cut down on sacks. Didn't get sacked Monday night. There was one play that was like borderline because he get back to the line of scrimmage. But other than that, he's moving well. He's getting the ball out quickly. And he's been, I think, appropriately aggressive. And that's something that I love seeing from a quarterback. Like when you have opportunities to make aggressive decisions and throws and push the ball downfield, he's taken them. Like he had a dig route against Washington on a dagger concept on 3rd and 13, where he fitted in right between two underneath defenders on the dig route. And it was an appropriately aggressive throw. And then you come down, I think it was very next play or 2 plays later, he hit Saquon on that wheel route touchdown out of the backfield. You don't get that wheel route touchdown if you don't make the aggressive decision on 3rd and 13. And so that really stood out to me. The game-winning drive against Green Bay Monday night. Joe Barry decides we're going to play soft. We're going to play, prevent the big play, keep things in front of us. So he's like, okay, I'll take what you're giving me. I'll throw the hitch. I'll throw the check down. I'll throw underneath. But the second they went press man, that's when he hit the big play to Robinson. So to identify that real time and realize I've got the opportunity now to take the aggressive throw and then stick it was huge to see. So, it's been a lot of fun for off the field reasons, I'd say, but it's been a lot of fun for on the field reasons.
How much have the Giants altered, excuse me, their game plan to suit what Tommy does well and what he doesn't do well? How different is it, would you say, from what they were running with Daniel and even for a little bit there with Tyrod Taylor?
I mean, I think there are some differences. There are some certain differences where, you see some run game elements that maybe they used last year with Daniel Jones, but seem to sort of be out of the game plan, out of the script with Jones earlier this season. They've done a lot with, and they did some of this with Jones, particularly last year, but it seemed, again, sort of missing this year. But wheel routes, leak routes, things out of the backfield off of play action, or even just straight drop back where, it's perhaps something that DeVito is a bit more familiar with, given the offenses he ran at Syracuse and Illinois. So you've certainly seen that. And I think that in a way, they've sort of, I don't want to say dialed back the game plan, but you could see, particularly in recent weeks, because of those sack numbers, an emphasis on either getting it out quickly or just taking off, because the sack numbers were such. And Emery Hunt had a piece along with, Dane Brugler, myself, Ed Valentine over Big Blue View. And Emery made this point where we haven't been talking about the offensive line a lot in recent weeks. And I think part of that is the emphasis on, okay, look, if it's not there initially, if you don't like your first 2 reads, like throw it away or take off or do something differently. We're not expecting you to get to the 5th read, to the 4th read into a play. Like, because of the protection issues we've had, sort of take care of yourself, take care of the football. 2nd and 10 is fine. 2nd and 9 is fine. 2nd and 8 is fine. 2nd and 17, that's not what we're built for right now. And so trying to stay out of those 2nd and long, 3rd and situations has been, I think, a point of emphasis. And that certainly helped him because it keeps the entire playbook open. When you're 3rd and 17, not a lot of plays in the playbook for that. When you're 3rd and 6, pretty much your entire playbook is open. And so I think that's been a big difference as well.
What about, you mentioned the surprise element, DeVito coming out of school, wasn't drafted. I'm sure teams scouted him. I'm not sure how many draft analysts really paid a whole lot of attention to him. But, I know this is kind of like a hard question to answer, but what was missing from DeVito's game that you think caused him to fall into that undrafted free agent range that he went in?
I mean, I think there were a couple of things at work. I think, it was a fairly deep quarterback class. Dane Brugler, for example, had him QB 16. I mean, there were a lot of names in this quarterback class, and a lot of quarterbacks got more sort of postseason, bowl game buzz, all-star circuit buzz and things like that. And I also think that like there were some things that he did well, but there were certainly areas to improve. And when you start thinking about, taking a flyer on a quarterback late in the draft, in the position where a team could have drafted him, you might look for like a big overwhelming trade. Like okay, well, he's got some things to fill in, like Aiden O'Connell, for example. He's got a big arm. He's got a big arm. And so a team might say, look, maybe the athleticism isn't there. Maybe there aren't a lot of things to truly like here. Maybe it's not a full, well-rounded package as a quarterback prospect, but he's got a huge arm. We can do something with that. Tommy DeVito didn't have a big calling card trait coming out, I think, from most draft analysts' perspective. And so I think that's one of the reasons you probably saw teams like willing to see him slide. And also, look, as somebody that's done this now almost for 10 years, quarterback evaluation, it's a crapshoot. It absolutely is. We miss all the time. Those of us that do it on the outside, those of us that do it for teams, those of us that have been doing it for 30, 40 years, people miss all the time. And people may have missed on Tommy DeVito, like they've missed on, say, Brock Purdy, or years ago, Tom Brady. Those are names that have certainly come up in the Tommy DeVito conversation in recent weeks, because you can't get the full picture sometimes. You can't get the, what's inside the player, what's inside their mind, what's inside their heart. Now, maybe the fact that he slid out of the draft helped motivate him, who knows? But maybe teams didn't get that full piece. But there's a lot of reasons that we miss on quarterbacks. There's a lot of reasons why we'll miss on quarterbacks in the spring, as I'm sure we're all going to do. But it's the QB evaluation part is so hard because, as you and I have talked over the years, there's so much that goes into it. And a lot of the reason that the Giants and Tommy are having success right now, I think, is a lot of the off-field stuff, is a lot of the like motivational, a lot of like rallying around the backup, the third string, the undrafted guy that you're seeing from the team from Saquon on down. I think that plays a role. And it goes into, you and I have talked over the years about how QB is a Monday morning to Sunday night evaluation process. It's not snap to whistle. It's not sideline to whistle. It's the full 7 days of being an NFL quarterback. And there's probably a lot going on inside that building right now, which you know a lot better than I, that is going into what we're seeing from this team.
What do you think DeVito's ceiling is?
Can he be a full-time starter? I think so. I think that's possible. That's the sort of ceiling that he's sort of like the quarterback you win games with. I think that's the ultimate ceiling. I think the sort of realistic is, he's your QB2 spot starter type, which you need. Look around the NFL right now. I mean, tonight on Thursday Night Football, we're recording this on Thursday morning, we get Easton Stick versus potentially Aiden O'Connell. I mean, you've seen teams that may have had playoff aspirations fall by the wayside because they lose their starting quarterback. And I've always been a firm believer, we've talked about this as well, you should have a very good QB2. If you want to be a successful team, you need somebody that if your starter goes down, the season isn't lost. And if that's ultimately what Tommy DeVito ends up being, is a very good QB2, that's a good thing. You can make a very good career doing that. Just ask Colt McCoy and Chase Daniel and the quarterbacks that have done that before. But you need that as a team, because if you're simply in the position of the starter goes down and the season's over, that you're really rolling the dice in today's NFL in the 17-game season. And so I think his peak ceiling, yeah, he could be a mid-level starter in this league, given what we've seen. Realistically, he's probably a QB2 type, but that's okay. And that's something that a team needs.
Now, Mark, I want to pivot to Daniel Jones. I want to talk a little bit about Daniel. Obviously he's on IR, the ACL, but to my eye, he looked like he regressed. And I know people are going to say, well, he didn't have Andrew Thomas for most of his time in there. He didn't have Saquon Barkley. He didn't have this. He didn't have that. But I watched Daniel, excuse me, and to me, it looked like he just took a step back from what he was able to do last year. What did you see in Daniel's game? And do you agree that he regressed this year in the snaps he played?
I do. I don't think he was comfortable at all this year. Like watching him last season to this season, I don't think he ever settled in comfort level wise. And this is also something we've talked about. Like if you're uncomfortable, if you're unsure, if you're questioning how much time you're going to have on a throw, whether the receivers are going to be there, whether everything's going to be synced up. If you're starting to get sped up, internal clockwise because you're getting pressured, you're never going to be comfortable and you're never going to be successful. And I think that's a lot of what we saw from Daniel Jones this season. The comfort level was never truly there. He started to speed himself up artificially, probably more than he needed to. He started to shy away from some throws that he was making last year, that he was attempting last year, that gets us to the balance of conservative play call and conservative execution versus being appropriately aggressive, which we talked about with Tommy a minute ago. I also think that, look, they probably, I don't want to say put too much on his plate, but thought that, given the stride that he made last year, he was going to be in a position to solve some things himself, to fix some things himself, that if a design wasn't there, he was going to be able to make something happen. And that didn't quite come together for him this year. And so ultimately, I think it was just, I stress this all the time. If you're not comfortable as a quarterback, if you're questioning what's around you, if you're questioning what you're doing, you're ultimately going to start questioning yourself. It's never a situation conducive to good quarterback play. And I think that's sort of where Jones struggled at the start of this year. And yes, there are reasons for that. We talk all the time, you and I, about context, about missing Thomas, about missing Barkley. But if you're the starting quarterback of a team that just made the playoffs and won a playoff game and you've got the big contract this year, the expectations are different. This isn't last year's version of Daniel Jones where the expectations really weren't there, but you made the most of it as a team and you had the surprise of run to the playoff. Games change now. Like, you're expected from the outside and in the building to make the most of the situation. That didn't quite happen. And so that's going to be, I think, a situation and perhaps attention to watch going forward.
Is Daniel salvageable at this point? Obviously he's got to come back from the knee injury, which I suspect is going to affect his mobility. But given what he has gone through, is he shell-shocked to the point where, maybe the Giants need to think about moving on from him?
I don't think they need to move on from him or anything like that. I do think that there's a path to him being salvageable. I think, what's fascinating about the Giants right now is they now have more options than they did, say, a month and a half ago. Like a month and a half ago, the discussion was, all right, can they get one of the top two quarterbacks in the draft? Like, are they firmly in the QB first round discussion? I think they have a path to not doing that now. I think they could take a step back. And of course, this could all change over the next couple of weeks. You lose out this season and maybe you are in the striking distance of a top quarterback and the conversation changes. But you keep winning some games. First of all, you might play yourself out of that conversation with a number of teams that, like that team right there, could be in the QB1, QB2 discussion. So you might eventually play yourself out of that. And then you have to go down a different pathway, which might allow you to get a wide receiver. It's a very good wide receiver class. And if you add, say, Malik Neighbors from LSU to this offense with him and Hyatt, I think Daniel Jones could be successful in that offense. I think Tommy DeVito could be successful in that offense. And so the conversation might shift around it. But I do think that if they lean back into some of the stuff that they did last year, if they get Daniel Jones into a situation where he's more comfortable and more confident again, if they do some things to help him like they did a year ago that maybe they didn't feel they needed to do this season, then yes, he can still be a starting quarterback for this football team. But now you have a potential option here with DeVito too. So they've got more options than they did, say, November 1st. And that's a good situation to be in.
With Daniel, though, you mentioned that, they need to give him more support. At what point, though, Mark? I mean, he's been in the league now, 5 years, 6 years, whatever it is. At what point do you just say, look, we're never going to get everything perfect. Excuse me, in front of this guy. Excuse me. We're never going to have the perfect offensive line. I mean, that's been a topic for the last 10 years or so. We're never going to have, a healthy Darren Waller, and not to be negative, but at some point you can't have everything perfect around a quarterback. So with that said, what do the Giants really need to do if they are to salvage Daniel Jones, do they need to roll back the game plan? Is that going to hold them back down the line? I mean, what can they do you think?
I mean, I think, you think about the things that worked for this team last year. And obviously, one of the things that worked was the QB run element. I mean, 120 designed quarterback runs last year. That was a career high for Jones. And that opened up a lot of other stuff in the passing game and even in the run game that certainly helped this team. And I think that there's, a way to sort of emphasize that again, that sort of QB athleticism component. Now, there's a question mark there. And that's obviously you're talking about a quarterback that's going to be coming off a big knee injury. And how effective will it be? And so I think a way to look at this is sort of a hypothetical. Say they decide to go, they address the offensive line in the first round instead of a QB, or they address wide receiver, neighbors, or somebody else in the first round. And now you've got sort of a healthy Waller. You've got your offensive line back. You've got another receiver. Daniel Jones has an opportunity at the start of the year to come back and you do some of these things in the QB run game. And, maybe you do some more things in the passing game, some more RPOs and things like that. And it's still not clicking. Yeah, I mean, look, it's sort of the proverbial short hook situation here with Daniel Jones. If the team even decides to run it back with him, I think it's sort of we're reaching the end of the line here with him. And if, as you say, you're right, you're absolutely right. It's never going to be perfect. It's rarely perfect for a quarterback in the NFL. And we're now going to be in year 6? And if you're still having these same issues, if we're at, say, Halloween next year, and the question is Daniel Jones the guy? I think you know the answer to that question if you have to ask it.
Is there such a concept that, one of the theories we had earlier in the year, and I'll run it by you, is that Daniel Jones was not an ideal fit for this offensive line. We mentioned the struggles, the injuries that the offensive line had, The line has settled down. They've been going with the same combination, but still not perfect. So that being said, when you don't have at least 3 studs on your offensive line to make a decent offensive line, and you have a quarterback back there who's slow to process, as Daniel Jones has been known to do, is that a recipe for disaster?
It kind of is. I mean, Dan Hatman, I know you know Dan. I was talking to Dan about offensive line play recently, and that's why, you mentioned the 3 studs thing. That's what Dan told me recently about the offensive line, right? A great offensive line has 3 good guys. That's it. Good offensive line has 2. Offensive line is a weak link unit, right? If you're a great offensive line and you've got 3 studs, you've got 2 guys that aren't. And if you're Dan Quinn, for example, where you line it up Micah Parsons, it's not going to be against one of the 3 studs. It's going to be against one of the 2 guys that isn't a stud. So you better be able to read and process and make decisions quickly, even if you're behind a great offensive line. And the fact that we're now in year 5 of the Daniel Jones experiment and we're still wondering about the quick decision making, it does make it seem like, is he the best fit behind such an offensive line? Because you've got to, and that's one of the things, particularly in recent weeks, you've seen from DeVito, is just he's getting the ball out. Even if it's a check down, there was such a fascinating conversation recently when Tom Brady had Josh Allen on his podcast. And Tom went into this long, lengthy spiel about how sometimes the best throw as a quarterback is the check down, is the throwaway. There are times when, it's 3rd and 17, late 4th quarter, and you're going to make a stick throw. You got to try it. But 2nd and 7 is okay, because you can live to see 2nd and 7. 2nd and 17, as we talked about earlier, not where you want to be. And so DeVito's been very good at, okay, I'll just get it out quickly, particularly in recent weeks. And maybe Daniel Jones, sort of watching it now as an observer, it's maybe it clicks now. Maybe it does. And you've seen that before from some quarterbacks where they get an injury, they get a chance to sort of watch and observe. And we've talked about this before. And maybe it helps them understand what they can improve upon. And so maybe it clicks. But again, we're in year 5. At some point, it's either going to happen or it's not. And I think that, again, gets into that hypothetical world of, okay, say they decide to run it back with Jones, with DeVito as their QBs going into next year, and Jones is the starter again, but we're seeing these same issues. Again, the hook will be quick.
All right. Now, Mark, I want to talk about some of the college prospects at quarterback. The odds of the Giants getting a crack at one of the top 2, or the guys that are considered top 2, probably slim to none at this point, especially if they keep on winning, but you never know. So that being said, when you look at the top prospects in this class right now, who would you say is the best fit for the Giants offense and why?
I mean, I think you can go in a couple of different directions between, let's take the top two, Caleb Williams and Drake May. I think you can go in a couple of different directions, and I think both could be a fit. I think, look, Caleb Williams is a dynamic athlete, is a dynamic quarterback. Now, he got into trouble this year against blitzes, against pressure schemes, and there were simply some moments where he was just simply trying to do too much, I think. But if you get him into an NFL offense and you get him into an NFL building and you basically say, look, stop throwing it into triple coverage. Like, you don't have to fix everything yourself now. You're in an NFL offense. He can be a dynamic NFL quarterback, and he can certainly make people miss. He has that ability, that feel in the pocket, those eyes on the back of his head, that athleticism to make a free runner look silly because he can make them miss. And I think that's going to be critical given some of the offensive line issues that we've talked about this show and some of the offensive line issues we've seen. But Drake May can solve some of those problems too. He's a good decision maker. I don't think he gets enough credit for the athleticism and the ability to create off structure. Certainly that's an area where I think Williams is better, but May is very good. One of the things I really like about May is the competitive toughness factor. And this gets into some of the stuff we talked about and touched on with Tommy DeVito. But, one of my favorite games so far of his to study was ACC championship game last year, 2 seasons ago, basically, where they got blown out by Clemson. But he's deep into the fourth quarter, still making plays and playing really well. And he threw some interceptions in that game, one of which was a disastrous sort of pick six. Wasn't his fault. Like, he breaks the pocket. He's running around. He's creating, makes a throw, and the receiver that he throws it to starts to put his arms up and then pulls him down, thinking the ball's not intended for him, and it's a pick six, and he just lets it go. That really sort of impressed me, seeing him in that game. And so he could be a fit for this team. Jaden Daniels is getting a ton of buzz right now. And I've talked to a number of sort of professional evaluators, media evaluators, and there's a lot of like, okay, maybe we're seeing like an Anthony Richardson type rise here. As you remember this time last year, Richardson was like, maybe he's a first round pick, maybe like 15th or so overall. By the time we get done in Indianapolis, there was a serious QB1 discussion about Anthony Richardson. And I think that's the rise that we're seeing right now from Jaden Daniels. He just won the Heisman. And I know it was a weird sort of season for Heisman Trophy winners, but, Heisman Trophy candidates, but he had a very good year and he could create explosive plays. I wrote about this Saturday night when he won. Like, I think Penix had 112 explosive plays, runs of 10 plus, passes of 15 plus, but almost all of the one was a pass, similar numbers for Nix. Daniels had more explosive plays than both. A lot of his were runs because of the athleticism that he has. And so you could do a lot with him in the run game. You can do a lot in terms of avoiding pressure. He can do a lot in terms of making defenders miss. And he might be in their sort of range. If they're picking 10, 15 or so, he might be there. The two other guys from the Pac-12, Nix and Penix, are fascinating to watch. Penix is going to get a lot of the like older prospect injury history. He might be the Hendon Hooker of this group, like we saw last year, who put up big numbers, certainly has the big arm, but has the injury history. So he might slide a little bit. And if he's there in the second round and you went in a different direction in the first round, he might be a fit, but you might have sort of the mobility questions, the injury history and things like that, which might lead you to Nix, who's more of your like point guard type quarterback. I think obviously the efficiency was there. But I think the Bo Nix you saw at Oregon was such an improvement upon the Bo Nix you saw at Auburn that you might look at him and say, look, get him in the right environment, get him into our system, get him into our building with our talent, and you could see a similar growth and development. And so I really am fascinated by this quarterback class. I know a lot of the focus will be who's QB1, and maybe Daniels makes it a 3-quarterback race. I don't know. I think the more fascinating discussion from where I sit is who's QB3. Is it Daniels? Is it perhaps Penix or Nix or somebody else? We might get a J.J. McCarthy heroic run through the playoff here, and he decides, I'm going to come out. That could make it interesting as well.
You mentioned that earlier in the program that the Giants left themselves with some different options now where they're not necessarily locked into having to take a quarterback given DeVito's development. So with that said, depending on where the Giants draft, obviously they may or may not have a shot at a quarterback, but let's talk about some of the maybe day 2 quarterback picks, some of the value picks that can step in. I mean, you look at the NFC East and Washington. Sam Howell wasn't a day 1 pick. Hurts in Philadelphia, I think, was a 2nd round pick. Prescott, obviously a 4th round pick. So the value can be found later on in the draft. Who are some of the guys that you think the Giants would be a fit for that are not necessarily in that day 1 range?
Yeah, a lot of it's going to depend on what we hear in terms of decisions over the next couple of weeks. Now, a name that always comes up when you get to this quarterback discussion is Shedeur Sanders, the Colorado quarterback. I'd imagine he's going back to school. I mean, they just signed, they just got a commit from the top offensive line prospect in the country. Colorado just got one of the top interior offensive linemen, a transfer from Indiana. Deion Sanders said, look, we're going to rebuild our offensive line. We're going to get big-time players in here. They're doing that. That makes me think that he's going back. The kid from Tulane, I think Michael Pratt, he's fascinating to watch. He was the AAC Offensive Player of the Year a season ago. Very talented quarterback, already committed to the Senior Bowl, so I don't think he's going to be playing in his bowl game. I think he's a quarterback that has athleticism, that has a good arm, that can make a lot of the throws that would be asked of him at the NFL level. So he's somebody I think that could, I don't want to say that he'll get 1st round buzz, but we've seen quarterbacks before go to Mobile or go to the Shrine game, have a good week, and suddenly it's like, oh, this is the guy that's going to sneak into the 1st round. He could be the player that does that. A decision I'm fascinated on is Carson Beck from Georgia, because I think he goes back, but I don't know. I'm not so sure he does. And there have been a lot of people that said, look, he certainly did more in that Georgia offense than, say, Stetson Bennett did. He was asked to do more in that Georgia offense and certainly made the most of it. Now, I know that, look, they didn't get into the college football playoff, but he's fascinating to think about. Some other quarterbacks that are sort of in that mix. Quinn Ewers, again, does he go back or not? If he's made a big improvement this year in that Texas offense. Now, obviously playing under Sark, there are some NFL concepts in that offense. Seems to sort of calm his game down a little bit more. Maybe he goes back to Texas. Maybe he transfers. I mean, they just had their backup quarterback transfer who's not going to be with them in the bowl game. So you got now Arch Manning as QB2 now in Texas. And there are a lot of people that say, look, Quinn's been great, but it's Arch time sooner rather than later. So maybe he decides, I'm going to transfer or I'm going to come out. And that could be a name to watch. So a lot of it's going to depend on what we see here over the next couple of weeks with decisions and transfers. And, if you get it, like I said, if you get a JJ McCarthy dynamic college football playoff scenario where he has a great game in the first game and then he leads him to a national championship, he might say, look, I've done all I need to do, especially if Harbaugh bolts for the NFL. And there's a lot of rumors that he will, and Michigan's trying to get him to sign a pledge that he won't, which tells you where they're thinking of. McCarthy could be somebody to watch, because if you would ask me, say, in October who QB3 was, I probably would have said JJ McCarthy at that point. And he had a great game against Michigan State, had a touchdown on a post route to split the safeties, which I heard it watching on film. You could hear the velocity on that throw. And so I would have thought he would have made the run, but then had the ankle injury, got banged up a little bit. They barely used him against Penn State. It was kind of along for the ride in a couple of their games. Maryland was another one where Harbaugh was suspended. They're leaning into the run game. Penn State, I think he threw 8 passes. I had a pretty good game against Ohio State, but if he has a great run, he might decide to come out. Might not be a 1st round QB, but could be a day 2 pick that the Giants would have their eyes on.
All right. It's going to be interesting for sure. Obviously we need to see where the Giants end up drafting. Still 4 weeks to go left in the season as we record this. Mark, never a dull moment.
Never a dull moment. Hey, look, I will say this, Giants fans, It could be worse. And I again point, I will eventually that, yeah, right, that Patriots logo right there. Like, I wondered if it's going to be Bill Belichick or Mike Vrabel or Ryan Day or Lincoln Riley coaching this team next year. It could be worse, Giants fans.
Yes, indeed, it could be. But listen, it's always great talking ball with you. I appreciate your expertise and your time that you give me. You're always so good, and I'm telling you, shame on me for not doing this sooner.
Well, we'll do it again. We'll do it again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, Giant fans, that's going to do it for this edition of Locked On Giants. Special thanks to Mark Schofield and to you guys for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day. Or if you watch on YouTube, your first watch of the day, check out Mark's work over on SB Nation and follow him on X, the site formerly known as Twitter. Does a lot of great work. For Mark Schofield, I'm Patricia Traina. We will see you again soon, Giant fans.